We're going to go ahead and get started to people in the room. And I know we have quite a few people either joining us online already or planning to join us online. So many of you know me. And so for those of you who do, you'll have to hear me repeat some of what I'm going to say this morning, but I have a little to add to it. So obviously did my training here in the Houston Medical Center. But before that training happened, I'm going to share something that I hadn't shared before, and that is that my twin sister, we weren't really twins, we were 18 months apart, but she had just given birth to her second baby. It was 2001, and her husband got the diagnosis that he had a non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And so I have sat on the side of watching a sister not sure if she would raise her children alone, and sat on the other side where we're now celebrating over 20 years disease-free remission. And so I know what it's like to be a family member of someone with cancer. And then in 2024, I was diagnosed with an aggressive squamous cell carcinoma. Have a tiny little scar on my chest. They thought it was going to be related to a head and neck cancer. So we went through a couple months of really intense concern. I'm totally through that. It's not a problem, but I'm just saying there's a personal aspect for me to keep showing up here year after year, driving what we're doing, bringing these key conversations. But I couldn't do it without so many people. I couldn't do it without Methodist Hospital Research Institute or Baylor College of Medicine, who, the many professors who believed in teaching me what it looked like to standardize things, look at numbers. I always, this time of year, call out Lisa Gregg for talking me into being the first PhD hired by BD to come and sell, because she bore witness with what would it look like to standardize flow cytometry. My time working with David at Methodist Hospital Research Institute, using CS&T beads for the first time to standardize our gamma delta T cell characterizations hadn't been done. It wasn't, white papers weren't written on it. So it's just been something that's been birthed inside of me and I've held on to for decades. And so I'm actually really excited to be here today once again, talking about spectral in the clinical environment, spectral cytometry. Definitely Sony years and years ago had a vision for what this was going to look like. They're our key sponsor for today, bringing both Stacie and Paul out here and enabling their labs to do what they have to do. I know that BD also stepped up, partnered with us, Cytec, Beckman Coulter. So we see our industry partners and BioLegend coming alongside saying, let's do this, let's get together, let's figure out what next looks like. So I actually normally wing everything that I say up here, but I prepared some words just because I didn't want to get lost. But many of you know what the Bethesda consensus is. Some of you do not. 20 years ago, there was a gathering of practitioners, much like those in this room and online today, and they did something profound, something with lasting impact. It shifted immunophenotyping from a local art to a shared infrastructure. It formed a foundation for modern hematologic medicine. That shift enabled uniform risk stratification across sites, including the Children's Oncology Group, reliable multi-center outcome comparisons, faster translation to trial results into practice, and MRD-based therapy applications. And in that era, pediatric ALL survival climbed towards 90%. And that's only one of the success rates that we have. And this is not because antibodies cured leukemia, but it's because measurement discipline enabled therapeutic precision. The real lesson that we learned from Bethesda was not in the markers. It was in consensus, transparency, shared definitions, shared resources, and agreement on what good was going to look like. Bethesda proved something fundamental. When experts align on measurement standards, survival improves downstream. But that was 20 years ago. That work was built on technologies originally accelerated during the HIV/AIDS crisis, which we're not going to lie, there was a lot of political will to solve that problem. When scientists at BD and Beckman refused to accept the status quo, they were on a mission, they were relentless, they refused to settle for good enough. And yes, companies were born from that era. Many new logos that we see here with us today, companies that have gone on to build tremendous good and seed further innovation. So we must ask, with those two great foundations, scientific courage and consensus-driven standardization, are we going to do them justice? What are we tolerating today that future physicians will look at and say, how did they accept that? 10 to 15% assay variability is something that's come up in many conversations. Is that enough in clinical decision tools? Lot-to-lot reagent drift affecting antigen density readouts that are crucial right now for patients. Non-harmonized MRD reporting across institutions, that means we can't use the data collectively. How about delayed data sharing because of competitive positioning, sometimes in boardrooms where science is asked to leave the room? Manufacturers waiting to solve problems instead of doubling down to accelerate their solutions. Institutions guarding IP while patients face relapse. If survival is the goal, variability is our enemy. And disunity is the silent tax that we pay on progress. So those of us in this room, we stand on that Bethesda's foundation and the foundation from those willing to innovate for HIV/AIDS. And I just lost where I was in my talk. Give me one hot second. Somebody texted me. Yep. Okay. So the question is not whether or not we honor it. The question is whether we advance it. What if we work well with our industry partners to be clear about what's wrong and what we need to do better to standardize antigen density reporting with chemistry level precision, establish benchmarks for tighter reagent lot-to-lot controls, precise reagents for precision medicine? How about we harmonize spectral controls and unmixing standards across platforms, maybe even across vendors? What if we share clinical assays learnings faster with each other and with the manufacturers who work with us? What if we collaborate pre-competitively on measurement infrastructure and we call the manufacturers to go beyond selling tools and partner with us in reducing any noise? Medicine must focus on healing, industry must focus on equipping medicine, and both must focus on the survival of the patient, which is at the end of everything we do. Most of us draw from the same funding pools. Those are taxpayer dollars, insurance reimbursement, and philanthropic grants. We steward public trust. So we must ask, are we building institutional advantage or survival advantage? IP matters. Innovation must be protected, but IP is the tool. It's not the mission. The mission is to push back the darkness of disease, to see more mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, brothers, and sisters return home from the battles that they've won. So Bethesda did not eliminate competition. It created a shared measurement that has accelerated the flow cytometry industry. Let's remember that. It created a market. It created a language so competition could happen on therapy, not on assay ambiguity. We don't win when we're lost. That is the model. Pre-competitive alignment on measurement, competitive advantage on treatments. First, do no harm. That's what we say, that's what we're taught. In diagnostics, harm hides in variability. If the patient is our first consideration, then measurement from their cells must be worthy of their life. We do not compete against one another. We compete against relapse, against resistance, against mortality curves that demand precision. Alone we innovate, but together we cure, because actually the only competitor here is the patient. And who they're facing is the fiercest diseases of our times. We are here today to discuss building and improving measurement systems that fight just as fiercely. So with that, I'd like to thank FlowTex, right, for being an innovation platform. Time and time and time again, we show up year after year to have these crucial conversations that are archived, that are easy for me to say, go on YouTube, look at this one, go on YouTube, look at that one. So these are crucial conversations. The committee members who've enabled this, the vendors who show up time and time again to partner with us as we have these crucial conversations, we couldn't do it without you guys. It is my distinct pleasure to be inviting again Paul Mead to come and speak to us about his work at St Jude's Hospital. And Stacie Woolard is also going to be joining him. She's been working specifically on their MRD panels. So I'm going to read just a little bit about their backgrounds. Dr. Mead is a principal scientist and director of the Translational Immunopathology Laboratory in the Department of Pathology at St. Jude's Clinical Research Hospital. His laboratory develops new flow cytometry assays for clinical immunopathology laboratory and supports St. Jude's led clinical trials. He is licensed medical laboratory supervisor and serves as a technical director for the clinical flow cytometry lab. Dr. Mead earned his undergraduate and graduate degrees in biochemistry from Massey University in New Zealand, and he completed his postdoctoral training at Harvard Medical School, Children's Hospital, Boston. As an NIH-funded investigator at St. Jude, his early research focused on the hematopoietic development during embryogenesis. For more than a decade, his work has centered on immunophenotyping and minimal residual disease detection in pediatric hematologic malignancies, with recent efforts focused on high-parameter spectral flow cytometry for clinical diagnosis and treatment and monitoring of pediatric leukemias. And he was a speaker last year and highly regarded and really anticipated for his talk this year. And because they're going to share this time, I'm also going to introduce Stacie to you. So her background is in research. She's a highly experienced flow cytometry expert with over 18 years in flow cytometry, where she's worked in the Flow Cytometry and Cell Sorting Research Shared Resource Center, including serving as the Assistant Director, Scientific Affairs for over 5 years. In this leadership role, she oversaw complex projects, managed staff, and ensured operational excellence. Currently, Dr. Woolard is a clinical scientist in the Clinical Pathology Department's Immunophenotyping Laboratory, where she applies her expertise to performing, evaluating, and reporting on flow cytometry test results. She's played a vital role in maintaining quality control, troubleshooting instrumentation, developing standard operating procedures, and contributing to scientific publications and presentations. Her primary focus is facilitating the validation and implementation of full spectrum flow cytometry in a clinical setting to improve MRD detection in ALL. Dr. Woolard ensures compliance with CGMP, GLP, and the regulatory guidelines, yay, from CAP, FACT, and the FDA, upholding the highest standards in clinical diagnosis. So I invite both of you to come.
Wow, what an introduction. And thank you again for the really kind words. And for having me back. As I said to Rui yesterday, I normally only get invited back to apologize for whatever happened the first time. So this really is an honor. So today, first up, I've got no conflicts of interest. So if anyone out there, please come and see me after. But I've got absolutely nothing to declare. So the outline of the talk today is going to be pretty straightforward. Last year, when I was here, I presented the design and the implementation of our 38-color spectral immunophenotyping panel. And today, I'm just going to give a very, very brief overview of how we got to the use of spectral in the clinical flow lab. And you'll see from the first few slides why it was a sort of a no-brainer for us to take on spectral. I'll give you a quick update of where we're at with the immunophenotyping panel that's been active in the lab for about 16 to 18 months now, and then talk very briefly about the design and implementation of our first MRD panel that went live about 2 or 3 weeks ago in the clinical lab. And then I'm going to hand off to Stacie because she did the lion's share of work of doing the analysis part of this very complex MRD analysis in the clinical lab. When Stacie has done a great job doing that, she's going to hand it back to me, and I'll give you a brief update of what we're up to at the moment, what are our future plans, and what is going on in the clinical lab. So this really is a really big team of people that have gone on to bring this to fruition. But I'm going to show a few people throughout the talk who are absolute key members of the group. And one of them is a scientist in the translational lab, Peijing Liu, and he was responsible for doing pretty much all of the design work you'll see today for the development of these panels. And I'm going to flash up some numbers and things as we go through, but just think all of those panels had been pipetted, single antibodies, one at a time into tubes, organizing all the samples and data analysis along with Stacie for these things. So, you know, that's why I show this picture. It really was a tour de force from Peijing. Now, before we start, I just wanted to bring up this slide to remind us all that So a patient comes into the clinic, and it's not just the immunopathology lab that's responsible for the diagnosis. There's a whole team of different labs and different groups and other ones that haven't even shown here, such as micro and molecular micro. But it's the overall picture that all of these labs paint that leads us to an accurate diagnosis and a treatment follow-up plan for the patient. But of course, today we're going to be talking about the immunopathology lab and our role in this overall workflow of identifying what the disease that this poor kid has got. So in the immunopathology lab, a sample would come in on day, we'll call it day 0 at diagnosis. The first thing we would do on that day would be running a immunophenotyping panel, and the purpose of that is to identify the lineage of the disease that may be present, if it's an acute leukemia, a B, T, or AML. Then also on that same day, we would run our MRD panel to be able to determine a baseline for the way that we were going to approach following that disease at later treatment time points. So for many years at St Jude, our immunophenotyping panel was quite extensive. It consisted of 13 tubes of 8 colors each, consisted of 46 surface markers and 4 intracellular markers. And for many years, for about 15 years or so, this is all done on the BD Canto 2, a 3-laser, 8-color cytometer. So upon running the IP panel, the hematopathologist would make the call about the lineage assignment. And because today we're going to focus on TALL MRD, we'll presume that this poor little blue child up here has got a T-cell leukemia. So then we would run the baseline TMRD panel. So that would consist, up until about a few weeks ago, of another 8 tubes on the Canto 2. And all of our MRD panels on the Canto 2 are based around is that a pointer? Oh, maybe not. Okay. Based around a backbone of markers that we use to identify the blasts. And then we have these add-on tubes on the side over here on the left. And these are to identify a leukemia-associated immunophenotype. And sort of taken together, both with these add-on and the backbone markers, they give us a difference from normal, and we're able to identify blast cells away from the normal, in this case, T cells in the sample. And this is kind of how it would look like. So here's a really typical TALL, and these are the backbone markers on that Canto 2 panel. And you can see a very dim population of these red colored blast cells. What we often see in pediatric TALLs is that they'll have high levels of cytoplasmic CD3, but lack surface expression of CD3. They'll have dim CD5 and dim CD45 compared with the bright blue normal T cells you can see here. And quite frequently, they'll be negative for CD19, 33, and HLA-DR. And so this is our backbone markers just to be able to identify blasts away from the normal cells that might be present in the same sample. So then we use our add-on markers, those 2 extra markers that we saw in the panel. And so, for example, in this patient, the most aberrant markers that are expressed are the TDT and 99. So for this patient, we would pick those 2 tubes, the CD99 and TDT. Those eagle eyes among you would have seen that there was a subset of blasts that also expressed CD10. So we'd use that as a backup tube. So for that particular patient, we would end up with a patient-specific MRD follow-up panel consisting of that TDT99 tube and also CD1A. So you can imagine this is all on day 0, when the child first came into the clinic. In our immunophenotyping panel, we've run 50 different markers and 13 different tubes, another 8 tubes for the TMRD diagnostic panel. And really, we've only one extra marker that wasn't already run in the immunophenotyping panel, so there's a lot of overlap between the 2 panels, all to identify a patient-specific immunophenotyping panel. So you can imagine this is a lot of work, a lot of tubes, using up a lot of cells. So if 1 million cells per tube, there's lots of cells being used that we could otherwise, for example, bank and use for other diagnostic tests later on. But the other thing to think about with here is that there's also a lot of pre-analytical work. So whenever this child comes back into the clinic at, say, day 8, day 15, or whatever time point the clinical trial dictates for their follow-up, then the technicians not only have to do all of the wet work, they also have to determine early on what panel needs to be run for that specific kid. So we have a lot of patients coming through every day, so there's a lot of pre-analytical work to make sure that the right panel gets run with the right samples. So just to give you an idea, we're not a busy service, but we're by no means like a reference lab or anything. We see around 300 or so new leukemias a year, and we do between 1,600 and 2,000 of these follow-ups a year. So that, again, a lot of this pre-analytical work, a lot of pipetting for these, the techs in our lab. As of about 2.5, 3 weeks ago, our panel or our workflows changed dramatically. So now a patient will come in, we run a single high parameter 38 color spectral immunophenotyping tube. This again has been active for about 16 months in the lab. We then do our lineage assignment, and now our first MRD panel has gone spectral. It's a 39 color TALL MRD panel. And the real advantage of this is that for every follow-up and for every patient, they always get the same panel. So there's no need to identify which patient gets which sort of follow-up panel. If you've got a TALL MRD, every time point you will get the same high parameter spectral panel no matter what. So it makes it a lot more simple. Now, if you remember that, or think about if the less complex that we make something, there's nothing not complex about a 39 color panel, but the overall workflow is much simpler than before. And so it's going to be safer, right? There's no chance of a TMRD being run on the wrong panel because all of the TMRDs get run on the same panel now. So it's something else to consider. Now, of course, our spectral format is the ID7000, and we use the 6-laser model, and we find that deep UV laser is really worth its weight in gold with adding all of the extra unmixing capability that it allows. So early on, we decided that we were going to try and fit as much of that 50 marker panel, that IP panel, into a single tube. And I won't go into a lot of details about it today, but we decided that with the amount of spread and everything that we could have a few years ago when we were designing this, that we would have a 38 color panel. And we decided to try to figure out how much of this can we squish into this single tube. And really, we spent a huge amount of time working on this panel design, but really in addition to developing the IP spectral panel, we were really trying to develop a palette of colors that we could use for later panel design so that we didn't have to go back and reinvent the wheel. This palette of colors was really essential for us to be able to quickly develop other high parameter panels. Even though some of the markers may move around and some of the fluorochromes now have been replaced by much better ones, we are able to use this sort of overall sort of palette of colors that we could put new markers on depending on the needs of a particular panel. So then Peijing would pipette all of these individually into tubes, run these on the ID7000, get these measured vectors for every different cell. And of course, I love a little bit of math. So we'd use our weighted least squares algorithm to be able to calculate with our single color controls and be able to determine omega hat, the estimate of the amount of each of these fluorochromes. And then we could plot them because we all love, we're flow cytometrists and we love our plots. And so I'm just going to really talk about one aspect of the panel design. And I know I talked about this last year, but it's really important because it is the core for all of our MRD determinations is the use of these live dead and nucleated markers that we put out on the red laser. And the reason they are so key is because these will become the denominator in our MRD calculation. So we often focus on being able to identify blasts very accurately to be able to get the numerator, of your MRD calculation, but equally as important is an accurate determination of what do you divide that by to get a consistent MRD analysis. So the way we went about it was we built into every single panel that we run this combination of a live dead and a nucleated dye. For our nucleated dye, we use DRAC5, and for our live dead, we use Zombie NIR. And we use this very early in our gating strategy after doing a scatter gate and a singlet discrimination. Then we immediately used our live dead and nucleated dyes to be able to identify this live nucleated cell population, which then becomes our denominator for our MRD calculations. I just sort of throw this in here just as a bit of a funny, but our live nucleated gate is really an undead gate. We've got a zombie and a Dracula. And so it's the Dracula is lying down on the x-axis, and this is the way that we identify this LNC population. You might see on some slides, Beijing calls it the Mead gate. I call it the live nucleated cell gate. But anyway, just if you see that, it's very sweet of him. But anyway. So then, just to show you, so then in our gating strategy, we'll take this live nucleated cell gate. And one of the important aspects of this as a cytometrist is that it dramatically improves the spectral output of our data here by getting rid of all of the debris and the dead cells. We significantly clean up our spectral output of the live nucleated cells, as one would predict. So then we start bringing in our different lineage markers like B cells, for example, and also different myeloid populations. Again, we won't go into any details on this, but I just love these plots. So by the end of this, we ended up with a 38-color immunophenotyping panel. And Beijing had run over 130 different samples, and we had a whole variety of Bs, Ts, and AMLs and of various other diseases. And for all of the patient samples, all 82 of them that were in this sort of translational data set, we had 100% concordance with the answers for those same samples that had been run over in the clinical immunophenotyping lab. So our next step was to hand this off to the clinical lab. Well, it's not really handing it off. We're all the same people, but. And so we bought 2 new ID7000s. We cleared out a bench in the IP lab. We called our 2 ID7000s Isaac and Newton, because we don't get out much. And then we handed this over to another star in this story, is Laura Key, and she did a lot of this wet work for this validation of this immunophenotyping panel. This is just a validation or part of the validation checklist that she came up with and we worked through. There's every line here is a huge amount of work. There's one line that says write new SOPs. We have over 300 pages of new SOPs and training documents and competencies and proficiency testing documentation. It's really, it was a tour de force. But in the core of our validation plan, I'm not going to get into this too much, but was that we wanted to run 20 Bs, Ts, and AMLs and run them at the same time on the Canto 2 and on the same day also run them on the ID7000 and compare the data between the two. So Laura went through, retitrated all the antibodies, she made cocktails and did a cross-platform sort of assays between both the Canto 2 and the Spectral. And finally, in our validation plan summary, we ended up with, we got very close to our 20 of each that we were expecting. And we decided that we could stop there. We had 26 Bs, 17 Ts, 21 AMLs, 1 MPAL, so we can sort of count that towards our Ts, and a few others. And again, we had 100% concordance with the Canto 2 data. Now, one thing that people have often asked is how do we go about doing the analysis for this? So on the Canto 2 for many years, or at least 15 years in our IP lab, what we've been doing is using FCS Express for reporting because we knew that this software could talk via data innovations to our medical record. And so when we brought on the Spectral, we thought that the easiest thing to do is, if possible, keep that part of the work process, as it were, the same. And we knew that FCS Express could talk to our medical record system. And so, and we developed our analysis of the IP38 panel into FCS Express, because at this time we're also moving from Cerner to Epic, and our LIS people said that we couldn't possibly bring on yet another software package while they're in the process of moving our entire medical record to a new system. So anyway, it works out very well. So here's just an example of a relapsed B-ALL leukemia that has been run on the Canto 2. And this is what the same output would look like for an ID 7000, looks pretty much the same. The other good advantage of this is that we wouldn't frighten our hematopathologists, because it looks virtually the same as what they've been used to looking at for the last 15 years. And they look very similar. You will notice that because we have these live nucleated gates, we can get rid of all of the debris and junk and dead cells that we weren't able to do over on the Canto 2. So we dramatically improved the output of our analysis by running this on Spectral. So we went from the translational lab, where Peijing had been doing the development, over onto the clinical lab. To go from that point of taking it from here to the clinical lab took 17 months to get it validated. So it might seem like a long time, but this was actually really fast, because not only did we have to do all of the work involved in reanalyzing around 100 more patients, but also we had to train all of the technologists. They all had to get familiar with unmixing. We had to generate new lab information systems and all of these other things that are now in place that should be a lot easier to move along on our MRD approaches. So now I'll just give you a really quick overview of how this has been going before I hand off to Stacie, and hope I'm not going too long. So this has been active in the lab now for just over 16 months. We went live in September of 2024 with what we called version 1. And we knew there were some minor issues with the panel, but we went live knowing that we'd have an opportunity to make some corrections later on. And within 6 months, we'd revalidated this entire thing with version 2, where we've changed out some problematic fluorochromes that both were not playing very nicely in cocktails, but also improved the unmixing capability of the panel. We took this time also to do some software updates, and also to change over our 3 ID 7000s into standardization mode. Be happy to talk about that later. And that was a big advantage for us as well. So over this time, we've run approximately 220 new leukemias on the St Jude IP38 immunophenotyping panel. You can see there's a lot more AMLs than one would expect. That's because at this time, quite fortunately, we're moving between different clinical trials. And so some trials were closing, whereas others were opening. We had opened a new AML trial, so we're actively recruiting AML patients. That's why the numbers may look a little skewed, but we have about 100 each of AMLs and BALLs. During this time, we've also been tested. We're a CAP and ISO accredited clinical lab. We've had at least 2 or 3 CAP samples that come through. These are challenges that they send you cells and you run the assay and check to make sure that you get the same answer. We've passed all of those since we've gone on to Spectral. We've also, just before Christmas, we underwent our first CAP inspection since our panel moved to the Spectral, and we had no deficiencies and no suggestions, which is a real win for the lab overall, that they found absolutely no problem with the validation or the use of the immunophenotyping on Spectral. I'm just going to give you a really quick example of all of these 220 different, just going to give you 1B, 1T, and 1 AML. Just because it's a flow group, we want to see some plots. So this is an example of patient 1, a relapse refractory 7-month-old baby that had BALL. And as you can see, this large red blast populations, DIM45, has heterogeneous CD22, no expression of CD10, weak to very dim expression of CD34, heterogeneous expression of NG2 and 123 and TDT, has uniform bright expression of CD133 and DR. So based on this phenotype, it would most likely diagnosis would be a mixed lineage leukemia rearrangement. And exactly in a week or so later, the cytogenetics and RNA-seq came back, showing that it was indeed a KMT2A fusion protein. In a second example, a 7-year-old female presenting with hyperleukocytosis. Whoops. And in this case, it had uniform bright CD34, heterogeneous 117. Also had some CD19. So immediately we need to start thinking about perhaps, say, a mixed lineage or MPAL. Had some expression of 79A, so that it sort of reinforced that idea perhaps of an MPAL. Very bright DR and also heterogeneous MPO expression. And also some expression of CD123. This is sort of typical expression pattern of a classical 821 fusion, and the diagnosis would therefore be an AML. So this would be a classic AML ETO, essentially fusion protein. Then finally, one that we had very recently, this was a consult case that came in. We just got a bone marrow came through the lab of a suspected T leukemia. And again, you know, a large red population of dim CD45 had this odd pattern of almost two populations, as it were, of a CD34 and CD117 bright population, and also a CD117 negative, but 34 sort of heterogeneous population as well. Looked a little even more odd on the CD10. We had a CD10 bright population and some CD19 expression. And the CD7 population, turns out that I've colored it in a little bit darker, but that sort of CD10 population corresponds with the 117 negative. That population is also expressing some cytoplasmic CD3. So it looks like there is a T cell leukemia as well as an AML hiding underneath there. And as you can see, the CD7 population has no CD19 expression. And the T component has some variable CD5 expression and TDT. And again, there seems to be this subpopulation that is dim for CD3 and is also dim for TDT. So overall, the T component has some CD1A expression, and the red population, the AML population, has some ectopic expression of MPO. So that our working diagnosis of this patient would be a bilineal MPAL, meaning that there are two distinct leukemias, a T component and also an AML component. So next, we were going to move on to looking at our T-ALL MRD development. So again, here's that Canto 2 panel that we started out with. And our goal was, can we fit all of this into one 39-color spectral tube, all of these markers plus more. We wanted to add in a bunch more myeloid markers and also a bunch of different NK markers that would help us with our gating later on. And so again, we went back to that palette of colors to be able to fill in all of the markers that we would need for this. And then we'd run both on the Canto 2 and on the ID 7000 to make sure that we ended up with similar looking plots. This is just an example of our acquisition template for the 39 color on the ID 7000. And at this stage, Beijing had run about 110 different samples and compared them again with the Canto 2 data that we're getting from the clinical lab. And this is where Stacie came in. We were able to recruit her away from the Shared Resource Center. And she's been an absolute bonus to our lab and has taken on all of the data analysis for this. So Beijing has been running this sample. Stacie has built a new MRD analysis in the Kaluza software package, analyzed all of these samples, and then we handed this off or moved the panel over to the clinical lab where Laura went about repeating the entire wet lab analysis, and Stacie has been doing all of the data analysis for this. So this validation, instead of 17 months, only took 5 months now. All of the things were in place. The fact we had Stacie that was able to do all of the data analysis for us really sped things along. And it was sort of in record time, we're able to now, as of about 2 or 3 weeks ago, taken this panel live into the clinical lab. And now I'm going to hand off to Stacie.
Is this the right answer?
Yeah.
Mhm. Sorry. Okay, quick question. How many people know what MRD is? More than I expected. I had no idea. So I came into this job with being a trained immunologist that found her life in the core facility where I became a cytometrist and had the opportunity to actually take my expertise and take it to the bench, not from the bench, from the bench to the clinic and do some translational work and actually see this be implemented into patient care, which is a dream for any scientist. So what I'm going to focus on that some people haven't talked about is actually the gating and the analysis, because you have so much data from these files. How are you going to, one, have your techs understand what they are doing, and also, sorry, I move a lot, train your hematopathologist to be able to look for what they're used to looking at and use the information within these spectral panels to get them information that's needed to look at the MRD, to monitor it throughout the treatment, but also look at what else is going on in the background. We've not been able to look at the bone marrow or the peripheral blood as we go through treatments because we haven't had these markers. So I was very lucky in the fact that I got to spend almost a year learning about leukemia, because I'm a viral immunologist. Even though I've worked at St. Jude, I haven't had a lot of opportunities to work with leukemia from start to finish. So before I go any further, I also have no conflicts to disclose. And why I was brought on was with MRD. Not many facilities actually do MRD monitoring, but it's really important because it's a prognostic tool. Do you have disease that's being retained throughout treatment? Because that's going to enable you to look at risk stratification. So over time, is your MRD going down or is it going up? Because depending upon the level, you would either stay on like a low risk dose of treatment or you go to a high risk dose, depending upon your MRD. And your MRD level can also have some implications of whether or not the patient can go into transplant. So using this decision, but we also need to look at everything else that's involved, not just the flow. We need to look at the cytogenetics. We have to look at the big picture to know what's going on within the microenvironment. And so, of course, I'm a flow cytometrist. I think it's great. It is highly sensitive, but we're taking it to a next step. It's very specific, and mainly it's the rapid turnaround. Because if you have to make a decision about a clinical case treatment, you want your results as soon as possible. So we started with TAL because we honestly don't see that many cases of it, so it gave us time to perfect what we wanted in our MRD approach. But it is very aggressive. It can affect the immature T cell precursors. In my previous life, I was actually an innate immunologist, so I've had to go back and learn T cell biology. It's 10 to 15% of all ALL cases. And what Paul will eventually talk about is we're looking at CS or CFS right now because this does have some CNS involvement. TALL is associated with poor outcomes and has higher leukocyte counts and is typically seen more in our male patients. Excuse me. And it tends to have a higher relapse risk. So it's very important as we are developing our gating strategy that we have to know, okay, where is our T cell coming from? How is our leukemia being generated, not generated, but where is it basically getting arrested in this T cell? Where does it become aberrant or difference from normal? So what you basically have to do as you're starting to think about designing an MRD gating strategy is you have to know the normal development of every cell, because if you don't know the normal development, how are you going to be able to tell the abnormal? So with all of the normal cases that we get within typically we do this in the translational lab. What we'll do is we'll combine and look at all of this normal data to try and establish normal stages. What is this normal T cell looking like through treatment or through development? And then also, within our leukemias, what are the different types of aberrant antigens that we may expect? Like we will talk about an MPAL. So it's a T leukemia that also has myeloid antigen expression. So I love to teach. And so what I do is I try to give a CE talk to the medical technologists because I want them to understand what we're doing as well. Try and explain to them, taking the antigens that are in our panel and saying, okay, this is what it should look like as we start from a hematopoietic stem cell and go through a single positive T cell, whether it's a CD4 or a CD8. And then, by the way, you don't have to know all this. I do. But also know at what stage you're potentially looking for your leukemia. Within T cell development, we also have T-ALLs that are called early T cell precursor ALL, or even near early. And all of the difference between these two types of leukemia is whether or not they express CD5. So if you don't know whether or not CD5 is on a normal T cell, that's really important to know. Also, when you're developing a gating strategy, you want to make sure that you don't start looking at your T cells at a general background, that you don't basically gate out what could potentially be an aberrant lack or presence of an antigen, okay? This right here, once again, is just showing how many steps are in T cell development. Don't worry, I'll be doing this again with B cells soon. But then knowing where am I in my T cell development so that I'm looking for this T cell, is it also due to maybe, I don't know, the treatment that we're giving? Or is this our clone that we're trying to track throughout the current treatment plan? So just to reiterate, we did have a 6 to 9, 8 color diagnostic tube per patient. And I've been doing spectral for over a decade. So when I moved to the clinic, I was like, why are you guys doing this? It should be in one tube. If nothing else, that saves your sample. And I understand that, everything has to be validated because I've written my first validation plan and it's terrible, but you're proving that you have a system that works. So using this, we moved everything to the ID 7000 to have our 39 color platform so that we could look at the leukemias, but we're also going to look at the lymphoid population, the myeloid, look at some progenitors. And then with this, yes, you're putting a lot of time and effort into it up front, but eventually we're going to improve processing time, reduce reagent and sample usage, and hopefully enhance consistency. Because by having me start doing this data analysis, I've had to go around and train the hematopathologists and say, you can't change this gate, okay? So that we can do our best to keep a standard approach. So this was the conventional TMRD analysis strategy. This was the panel, and this was what it looked like in DIVA. So when I first saw it, I immediately wanted to have a panic attack. Like I said, we've been doing 15 plus colors for a while. And so I'm like, why hasn't this reached the clinic yet? Because this is where Spectral is going to shine. But I have also learned I have to check my privilege at the door. Not a lot of places have the capabilities to do this. So it's on us that have this to be able to share the message, okay? And with this, we are using our gating strategy to look for those leukemic immature T leukemia cells in the bone marrow and the peripheral blood, okay? Also, within our validation, we had to look at pleural fluids because some kids with TLL will have the mass, mediastinal masses. And so those are actually really good to look at normal T cell development. So They really added a lot to our validation plan. And so within our panel, basically we have them broken out so that we can look at the B lineage, we can look at NK cells. Do we have the absence or presence of blastic NK cells? Look at the myeloid compartments, because we do have MPALs, which are mixed phenotype acute leukemias that show up at St. Jude a lot. And then also our markers for the immaturity and blast tracking, along with some other markers that are important for like developmental and looking at the granulocytes and the also, like I said, I'm an immunologist. I'm looking at basophils. I'm looking at everything because we can. So really quick, you're not going to be able to see this, but this was, I had to develop a strategy. How are we going to do this gating strategy and keep everything together so that we're all on the same page, looking at the same clone and not get lost in the data? And it's very much, we had to follow a stepwise approach so that we're all looking at the same population together. And so I'm basically going to walk you guys through that. Okay. Within normal development, guess what? You also have to think about time points, because within every leukemia, and this one I'm talking about T, hopefully next year or the next when we talk about B leukemia and I'm back, there's going to be more time points involved because they tend to have more time points within their protocols. But you need to know what time point, what your cells should look like at that point and be able to pull your blast, your clone away from the normal cell populations. So this right here is just showing you we have early induction, looking at whether or not the treatment is working, end of induction, and then later we have a consolidation phase. Excuse me. And so depending upon the protocol, that's going to dictate what or how many times we see these patients for follow-ups. So for us, it was very important to be able to track these across the time frame, okay? So this is our current TLL MRD analysis workflow. I chose Kaluza C because I really liked how it was very similar to DIVA. And you're like, well, people need to change. Yes, they do, but we're going to do it slowly, okay? Because the best thing to do is to make sure that everybody understands what you're doing to get somebody to buy into this new technology. So I created a TMRD template, and this, one of the reasons we also went with Kaluza is because it was actually already ready to be, it was IVD, so it could integrate into our LIS, our patient record system. And that was a big bonus for us, trying to avoid doing any more manual entry. And so within this, I learned about, creating protocols and creating composites, because ideally what I want to do is have a basic TALL gating strategy. And then once a patient comes in, each patient is potentially going to have, or more than likely going to have, a different type of leukemia. So create a gating strategy that is patient-specific and keep that as a reference throughout the entire treatments, and keep pulling in, last positive to see if we have any aberrancies that may arise due to treatment, or if we have any antigenic shifts or immunophenotypic drifts. Okay, and when we get into the B leukemias, not today, but later on, we know that some B leukemias can actually change into an AML. So can you find that earlier on? So the scariest part of this was that the hematopathologist had to go through 11 worksheets, and that they could not change the gating. So also, standardizing a gating strategy where nothing is ever normal is not the easiest thing to do. I'm used to having a really nice negative control. You cannot have that in the pediatric cancer world. So you're having to basically look at cells and prove to yourself that I am looking at my leukemia. And because I joined the lab without any sort of leukemia knowledge, I basically designed this as if I was teaching myself, okay? And by doing this, hopefully we can actually use this for onboarding, because hematopathologists do not get the world's best onboarding, and they need to know, especially if we're going to throw 39 colors at them. So, and I'm going to go through each one of these and kind of show you a summation at the end. So remember, with this, we're always no immature T cells in the bone marrow or peripheral blood. So you need to know that if you see CD1A, that's a cortical antigen. So it should never be in the bone marrow or the peripheral blood. So you need to know things like this. Also, as Paul talked about, defining our mononuclear gate so that we can do all of the calculations inside the software. Being able to alleviate any sort of human error is our, main goal. And then basically using that stepwise approach, look at defining our cytoplasmic CD3. And as Paul showed, we had a case that was a bilineal T. I missed it the first time through because our first thing is go off the cytoplasmic CD3. So being aware that our gating strategy may have to be dependent upon these different cases. So if it's an MPAL, maybe we don't start with the first case or the first gate being a cytoplasmic CD3 to, basically identify our T cells. So these are things that we're doing now. So we have these lineage markers, and then we have the immaturity markers, and then maturation. Is our leukemia getting arrested somewhere in T cell development? Once again, I'm not a T cell biologist, okay? So also at the same time, we also wanted to look at the CD19 cells, look at CD33 and DR to look at blast-like events. Right now, there are not a lot of normal gates in T cell development. And even in B and AML, there are normal gates. These are guidelines. They are guidelines. They are not. So you have to take everything into the big picture before you identify your MRD. And what we tend to do is focus on the CD45 DIM population that's cytoplasmic CD3. Now, once again, I've already talked about near ETP and ETP. So those I already know will have to have a different approach because of the CD5 expression. And so I often refer to our blast gate or our cells of interest, COI, and also the hematopathologist, the analyst. We cannot change the name of that gate because that name is built in all of our formulas. So just even that, making sure that they keep calling the same gate, the exact same thing over and over, because, and even things like this, when you're doing manual entry, you could just change this. So let me go back one. I tell everybody, this is the hardest page. This is the hardest page. And so if you can identify your LAIP on this page, your difference for normal, what I did was basically use these next sheets, and I got told I got very little time, was basically use them to build my confidence that I am looking at my two leukemia. And let me go back really quick. What stage is it arresting in? But everybody's like, why do you want to care about the B cells? I want to know, is my bone marrow regenerating normally? So can we use our other cells to look at marrow recovery? Do we have normal B cells? Use our other populations as internal positive and negative controls to help boost the confidence of our gating for our cells of interest. Like I said, internal immune controls, and it's also, like I said, important for post-therapy MRD evaluation. This one right here, this is another basically quick sheet that I built that with the first plot, if your cells of interest were to fall outside of this one, this is an ETP. If you know that your case is not an ETP, you would just move on. Same thing right here. If you were to look at this and your cells of interest didn't fall in the first gate where it would be an MPAL, you move on. So each of these little sheets basically could just be a 1 to 2 minute quick check and saying, yep, I really do believe what I'm seeing on this first page is what I am calling my cells of interest. Because we work at St. Jude, we have a lot of other departments that would love some of this information. So we also like to collect the percentage of the CAR T targets that we can pass along to bone marrow transplant. And what I loved was the ability to create these patient-specific reports where I can communicate with the hematopathologist, tell them this is what I think, and we keep these notes going throughout the treatment. And at this stage, I am now going to create this and save this as a patient-specific composite. So this patient-specific gating has been saved so that the next time when they follow up right here, I can basically import that composite, add their FCS files, and see if there's still any residual clones there. And this kid was actually MRD negative. So having the ability to pull in something from a previous time and see the notes was a huge bonus for us. Also, as we keep going through this, you have to keep thinking of what's coming in the field. So developing gating strategies so that you can alter your gating strategies to account for any of these antibody or CAR T treatments, so that we can track our multiple LAIPs, because we've noticed within adding these additional colors that within our samples, we may have 2 or 3 cells of interest. We all know that CD99 and TDT goes down with treatment, so why are we using it as an MRD marker? Can we use other markers and just use that one first and look at the correlation? So once again, I'm not going through this, but this is just showing you the different types of TALLs that we could see in our clinic. So knowing the different gating strategies for each is essential. And I'm gonna real quick, why is this hard in the clinic? It's really complex. It also requires a lot of data storage and management. Do you have basically the funds to keep up with a computer? Because we have learned you have to have really specific towers. Also, the instrumental and technical complexity and the standardization and validation. I have never hated a word so much until now. And I'm about to do our BALL MRD validation, and I want to cry. So also, there's reimbursement and clinical acceptance. We don't bill for a lot of our antibodies. So it is, telling a clinician that you need this many markers when they have to bill, and you don't. So it's one of those, you really need to look at your situation and see what is within your scope. Also, training and expertise. I just happen to fall into this. I'm telling everybody now on the research side, think about clinical. This is a time where we could all use the crosstalk. And I have to say, I love that my samples never show up GFP positive. Also, we have to think about regulatory issues. So proving to yourself, but proving to the FDA that you have a good assay. And also, it's a lot of money up front. So you have to have the stakeholder buy-in. So these are all my people. We can show them again, it's the same ones. And then, do you want to finish up? Do we have?
Stacie, that was wonderful. Wow, that was great. Thank you, Stacie. How do I go to my slides? I'm a little challenged. Now. Okay. Fantastic. Well, thank you again, Stacie. That was great. So what is next? A blank page. That's okay. That was where Stacie's talking. So what's next? So the next on our list, and part of our overall plan for bringing on these spectral high dimensional panels for MRD was obviously the BALL. So this is the most common type of pediatric leukemia. And we had a real clinical need to upgrade our BALL because of all of the immunotherapies that are coming along. So these had often been just reserved for relapse and refractory cases. Now they are becoming, in the new protocols, frontline therapies for kids with acute leukemia. So our panels had to adapt to be able to account for the fact that we're going to be losing a lot of the markers that we use to gate on, like CD19 and 22, etc. Okay, so we had the same sort of plan. We had this BMRD panel that had been running for 15 years or more on the Canto 2. And can we fit this entire thing into one 40-color tube plus a whole bunch of other markers that we may want to use? The answer was yes, and again, we use this lovely palette of colors to be able to choose our marker selection. And again, we ran samples on the Canto 2 and on the ID7000 with our various iterations of the panel to show that, yeah, they all look the same. So this was our 40-color BMRD acquisition template on the ID7000. And Beijing had run a huge number of samples. We had almost 100 patient samples that had been run on both the Canto 2 and the ID7000. some normal bone marrows and normal peripheral bloods. So Beijing had been running those. Stacie had built the new Kaluza template for the 40 color B, had analyzed all these 130 different samples, and we thought, great, we are ready to hand this panel off. It is functioning perfectly, and then can we add another marker? Because by now, our clinicians thinking, oh, they can do 38 colors. They can do 40 colors. Can they do 41? Can they do 42? And then we're thinking, oh, and I asked ChatGTP to sort of summarize this, and there's me running. I don't run. But one more marker, and so it seemed like the finish line was moving further and further away. So, this breaks my high parameter heart. 4 chambers, but high parameter. The only thing to do was to split our 40 color panel into 2. So we decided to do this for a number of reasons, right? So the 40 color panel was working beautifully. Even up to 42, it seemed to be functioning really nicely. However, to be able to future-proof ourselves, we knew there were going to be more markers coming along. And we wanted to add flexibility into our panel design so that we could add markers as they became clinically needed. So there are a lot of CAR-T targets now on the, that are going to be coming along and quite quickly into the clinical service, and we need to be able to adapt to those quite quickly, not only CAR-Ts, but other immunotherapies. So we wanted to be able to add these in without necessarily increasing a lot of spread in our matrix. Increasing spread would probably have a deleterious effect on our overall sensitivity. So, and the other thing that we wanted to think about too was that a lot of these markers are rarely used. They may be quite esoteric markers, and so they may not be available in very many fluorochromes. And we have sort of an unwritten rule in our lab that we only use commercially available catalog-driven markers. So we don't make any custom conjugates. And so that would really reduce our choice of fluorochromes that we could use in our panel design. And so we would have to keep moving everything around just to fit in a new marker, and that would mean a whole new validation. And it would basically stall everything and be quite impossible. So we decided to go to a 2-tube B. So we had both tubes have a 14 marker backbone. So there's a lot of markers that we share in common. And of course, then we have 14 markers in each tube, and there we get our 42 markers. But this would give us a lot of flexibility in the future to be able to add any markers that may come along. Again, it sort of broke our hearts a little bit, but that's, so then Beijing went back with these 2-tube B-ALL MRD panel. Stacie then rebuilt the B Kaluza profile to make use of these 2 tubes, and then redefined all the normal gates using normal regenerating marrows to be able to identify where the normal hematogones or normal regenerating B cells would sit with an. So, and again, as Stacie had pointed out, these are, we use those, and our hematopathologists use them as guidelines to be able to determine where the normal regenerating cells would sit on our MRD profiles. So now we've handed this over to the clinical lab, and Laura's been doing the wet work, and Stacie will be doing all the data analysis, and we've just started this validation. We anticipate going live with this MRD panel in August of this year, so in about 4 or 5 months. So one of the things that I didn't really bring up in the TMRD, but also obviously sensitivity is a really important thing. So one of the things that we do during our validation is to determine how sensitive is our assay. We want to determine a limit of detection and a limit of quantitation during our validation process. And one way that we do this is to take patient samples that happen to come along that are right near the borderline of being positive or negative, and run them on both the Canto 2 and the ID 7000. Now, during our validation time, a lot of those samples may not come through, so we also do these dilution series by taking blasts from a high blast count patient and diluting them into normal peripheral blood or bone marrow mononuclear cells. And Jiao Hong Yin, a really talented person in my translational lab, is really good at making these dilution series. So then we would take, for example, a 5% and then do a 10-fold serial dilution of these into normal mononuclear cells and see how far down can we go and still be able to detect our blast counts. And we do this with multiple different leukemias to start with, and also cell lines, so that we are not sort of biasing our ability to detect leukemia based on the original phenotype of the leukemia. So for example, here we have our 5% blast, and obviously you can see these, the red cells again are the blast cells, and in the background in the gray are the normal mononuclear cells. And we can sort of draw a reference gate around that blast population and do the MRD calculation again based off that live dead cell gate that we showed earlier on. So our target was 5%, we got 4.3%. And if we go through our serial dilutions, 0.5%, again, 0.4, you get the idea. And all the way down to the well below our detection limit. So our positive threshold for MRD is 0.01% for the T's and B's. And so our limit of detection is well below that threshold of 0.01%. So other panels that are in development, and I'd really like some feedback on some of this, would be great. We have what we call very affectionately our overflow panel, because the IP38 color immunophenotyping panel is not enough. There are now, if you build it, they will come to you with, can you also run this? And we want to add a whole bunch of other markers. So we have now a 30 color sort of overflow panel, which has a lot of these rarer markers that may be useful in certain situations. We also need to build a lymphoma panel as well that will either be added onto the overflow panel or be a separate panel altogether. We're also, at the moment, Beijing is back in Memphis, busily preparing away a 3-tube 28-color AML panel. This is divided into 3 sort of panels where they have monocytic markers, lineage markers, and early markers across this 3-tube 28-color. Again, we split it apart to be able to increase our flexibility of adding more markers as we need to in the future. And then finally, I'll just close on this. It's very much a work in progress. There's a CSF tube, and this was only a 23-color panel, and I thought, oh, this is going to be easy. This has turned out to be the most difficult panel to build. And if you think about it, and I should have thought about it a little carefully, but as soon as I thought, wow, how do we do this? A CSF is going to be very hypercellular, right? So you need all of your sample to run the stained sample. How do you do your autofluorescence? There are no unstained, there's not enough sample to be able, you can't take more CSF out of a small child. It's just, you just can't do it. And so you don't have any unstained control. So how do you handle the autofluorescence? And these samples are going to be highly autofluorescent because they're going to be fixed. They're going to have cells that are very autofluorescent. So how do we handle this? So we went back to our palette of colors, and I thought, well, and feel free to laugh at me. We thought, well, where is most of the autofluorescence? It's going to be sort of down my side of the panel. And so I thought, what we'll do, we just won't choose any markers that are down that end of the panel, and can we build a panel that sort of avoids where most of the autofluorescence is coming from? Okay, I see various people laughing already, so which is nice. And at the moment, it seems like it is really working, right? So it's obviously not ideal. So for example, here's a recent relapsed AML patient. And this is taking that overflow panel that I just mentioned and running it on a peripheral blood sample. And we can see this high level of AML blasts. And then if we take that CSF panel running on a CSF sample, obviously, and we can see that, yes, there is involvement of those, the leukemia in the CNS of this relapsed patient. So it does appear to work, obviously not ideal, but it does seem to be working. So as we've shown you today, our overall workflow has changed from being the very complex Canto 2 based system to going to a much more organized, ordered, high parameter spectral flow workflow. So it just leaves me to thank the incredible team of people that I get to work with every day. And by translational lab, I've mentioned Peijing, and Zhao Hong and Mo. We're really blessed to have a really great team of hematopathologists who are really a lot of fun to work with, and they're incredibly knowledgeable about leukemia. And they're led by our division director and medical director, Jeffrey Clow. Priya Kumar was our medical director, and she's recently left to go back to New York. Marsha, Gabriella, Yen, and Xiyu round out our hematopathology team. A real big shout out to Jeff Clapper, who used to be with Sony. He's now retired, but he was a huge help to us early on in our early spectral days. And really the unsung heroes of all of this are our clinical immunopathology group, led by Christy Embry, our manager, and Laura Key, I showed you, is our validation scientist, as it were. And we've been lucky enough to recently recruit Stacie Woolard, who's doing all of our data analysis. Celine, the supervisor, Lisa, Chris, Pam, Rath, Rachel, and Robin are all of our med techs that do all of this really hard work. And with that, I'll take any questions, and thank you. Jeff got to show his cats, so I've got my cat here. Oh, yeah.
Okay. If I remember correctly, you said the first spectral panel took about 17 months to validate, and the next one took like 5 months to validate. And as someone who is just embarking on developing and validating spectral panels, what do you attribute the shorter length of time the second time around?
Great question. Well, once we had Stacie now to help us with that. But also that 17 months also involved training all of our med techs who'd been used to 15 years of working on a Canto 2 to go to spectral, doing the unmixing. We had to develop new proficiency testing documentation, and also the testing, training documentation, competencies, you know, all of that was, so now that all that paperwork is essentially in place, that we can move that from each system, but building all of that de novo took a long time. All of the SOPs that were sort of lab specific, I mentioned there were well over 300 pages of new SOPs, and you know, from generating single reference control libraries and how we manage those, how we manage verification of different spectral references. Just for example, every new lot of antibody gets a new spectral reference. Every new shipment of it, that same antibody, even if it's just 1 day apart, that gets a new spectral reference. And the most recent or the spectral reference is always matched to what was the antibody that was used in the cocktail that has been referenced. So there's, you know, there's a lot of documentation that is needed to make sure that all of that is verified, and you know, that we keep track of all of that as well.
And I'm going to add to that you don't forget your first panel. Take those lessons that you've learned, you know which dyes don't work, and then also don't reinvent the wheel. If you know you have a good backbone that is working, stay with it. So that's one of the things, because like, even though we've switched some of the, like for the gating strategy, I was using some of those plots initially on the B, and I'm like, well, if I've already made them, why not just adapt them to the T? Because you already have that information. So.
Hi, good morning. I'm from a translational lab, so don't get my question wrong, but I use ID 7000 on a regular basis. And in my hand, I can go up to 1 to 10,000 dilution easy for the limit of detection. But for clinical purposes, to find out the MRD, you're stopping at 1 to 1,000 dilution. Is there any reason for that? Or say you showed the data that you started with 5% blast, but you stopped at 0.005, so which is basically 1 to 1,000 dilution. So is there any reason for that you're stopping there?
The only reason we stop there, I'm sure we can go lower than that, is that our clinical threshold is 0.01%. So we just needed to show that our detection was below our absolute threshold for calling MRD positive or negative. That was very good question. But yeah, we're virtually certain we could go much lower than that. But yeah.
Okay, so there's a lot of questions online for both of you. So, but we're running a little bit behind. So we're gonna ask you to ask maybe more online in the chat. But we'll do one, which is from Evan, who's asking to Stacie, have you added autofluorescence to these yet? Do you think that AutoF signature could be a marker for MRD detection?
That would be really hard to see about autofluorescence, but we do autofluorescence subtraction within our unmixing. So, but no, I do not use it as a parameter.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Well done, both of you.